All right, now before we get into verse 22 and continue on with Abraham 1, I wanted to share some information about Ham and his descendants we learned from Hugh Nibley. He says, in the ancient records, the blood of Ham is a mixture, always containing more white than black. The mingling of Egyptian and Canaanite is attested in a number of ancient sources, as in Abraham 1:21. Josephus tells us that the countries occupied by Ham stretched from Syria and Mounts Amanus and Lebanon to the ocean. And while Ham is the ancestor of Pharaoh in Genesis 10:6 through 20, the line also includes the Philistines, from whom Palestine gets its name. Recent studies of the genealogy of Cain by Johannes Gabriel and Robert North emphasize the claims of such desert tribes as the Kenites and the families of Kenaz and Caleb to belong to the family. Though the Hamites are as conspicuously Asiatic as African, the oldest African stock as well, Libyans, Tenahu, Berber, were not only white, but often referred to as pale-skinned and red-headed. Joseph Karst detected an extension of the chain of Hamite people, Cushites, Egyptoids, and Libo-Hamites in enclaves all over the Mediterranean and the islands clear to Spain. Linguistic evidence intertwines Hamites and Semites the further back in time one goes, their vigorous rivalry being evidenced in the earliest Egyptian hieroglyphics as shown by Hans Stock. Werner Wicklow finds Semitic traits in the beginning in North Africa, perhaps due to a wave of Hamitic tribes coming from Asia via the Strait of Alcantara, as the Arabs came later. The Hamitic invasion, he includes, certainly came from the east, though originally the Hamitic languages were not a single block, as were the Semitic. So some interesting ideas, just some heritage on Ham himself, where he came from. We're going to learn a little bit more about his descendants as well and how that ties in. So some little interesting facts to think of when we look back in history of to where these groups came from and how they spread out. Some fun, interesting ideas around genealogy. Okay, so let's get into verse 22. From this descent sprang all the Egyptians, and thus the blood of the Canaanites was preserved in the land. So remember verse 21, we talked about how the king of Egypt was a descendant of Ham, and particularly the blood of the Canaanites by birth. So this mixing together, and so the Egyptians were a lot more of a Canaanitish type blood. Let's see, I think I just don't have any other quotes with that verse. Yeah, okay, so the next one is in verse 23. The land of Egypt, being first discovered by a woman who was the daughter of Ham and the daughter of Egyptus, which in the Chaldean signifies Egypt, which signifies that which is forbidden. Now, this is something that is really interesting, that we get this little glimpse of where did the nation of Egypt come from? What is the origin of Egypt? We don't get a whole lot here. Verse 23 and verse 24 tell us a little bit of, and verse 25 tell us a little bit about what's going on. So let me read these. I've got a lot of quotes. Verse 24, when this woman discovered the land, it was under water, who afterwards settled her sons in it, and thus from Ham sprang that race which preserved the curse in the land. Remember, the curse wasn't so much the people as it was the land that they were on was cursed. So, and it's interesting when they talk about finding the area of Egypt, this woman discovered it was underwater, which means it was during the period of inundation. So every year the Nile floods because Egypt, northern Egypt especially, is built in a delta, basically. It's a big floodplain. So in the seasons of Egypt, you have the inundation period, which is usually referring to more of our springtime. There's a lot of water that accumulates from the storms that hit Central and Southern Africa and then flow downstream. Okay, the Nile flows to the north. So downstream is north in Egypt. And all that water comes out, and then the Nile floods, which puts out a whole lot of material, sediment and things. It's very, makes it easier for growing, very fertile all over the place. And then from there, it allows, after the inundation, the water goes down, you have this very fertile land to grow on, and that's your growing and harvesting time. And then they have kind of a drought period where there's not much going on. Basically, it's a harsh time, and then it goes back into the inundation period. So those are the three major seasons that Egypt has, basically. So let's look at some of these other sources that Hunibli gives us to understand more about Egyptus and Egypt. So he says, Egypt is the Chaldean name for the land. Here, the book of Abraham is right. Egypt is not the Egyptian name for the land, but was first applied to it by the Canaanites, making its first known appearance in the Ugaritic as HKPT, that being an adaptation of the old Egyptian name for Memphis, which the Egyptians did not apply to the land as a whole, but only to the city. It was the Chaldeans who gave it to the land. Such is the prevailing, but by no means only explanation of the name among scholars. So here's another point. The Egyptians, like Pharaoh himself, were of mixed stock, being partakers of the blood of the Canaanites. Unhindered by natural boundaries, the Canaanites at all times filtered into Egypt by the oldest road in the world, presenting a recurrent menace throughout all of Egypt's history, according to Gardner. Now the delta that attracted them was like the garden of the Lord, offering tempting grazing and farming lands from the earliest times. Examination of skulls from Canaan shows an array of cranial characteristics surprisingly similar to those of ancient Egypt. So question, who were the Canaanites? Answer, the title Canaanites, if it be used at all, must be reserved for the 3rd millennium Semitic inhabitants of Syria, Palestine, and their 2nd millennium descendants. So this is a third point as well to understand. There has been a great deal of hair splitting on the subject of Egypt and Canaan. But one sure thing is that Canaanite blood was shared one way or another by almost every pharaoh whose line can be traced. Pharaoh, the eldest son of Egyptus, the daughter of Ham, and Egyptus. The name Egypt is a title, as was Pharaoh, which signifies king by royal blood. And it was given to the land just as the title of Pharaoh, like that of Caesar, was given to all who ruled after him. As in the Old Testament, father can mean ancestor, or son or daughter can mean descendant. This is clear from Abraham 1:26, where Noah is called Pharaoh's father. So realize that the name Egypt isn't necessarily the name they gave the land, but more of an understanding of the names that they used to describe the area, basically. So there's other names and other things that kind of tie it together. Like it says, Egypt was more of a word that others used to talk about Memphis, which was the capital of Egypt for a long time. And now here's another point. Pharaoh's claim to the priesthood was invalid because he insisted with great force that it was the patriarchal priesthood of Noah, received through the line of Ham. Now his earthly rule was blessed, but he could not, of course, claim patriarchal lineage through his mother. There is an interesting parallel here with the case of Job, who, according to a newly found testament of Job, though the most righteous of men and a direct descendant of Jacob or Israel, cannot claim a place among the patriarchs of the line, because it is through his mother that he relates to Jacob, while his father's line through Esau was invalid because Esau had forfeited the priesthood. Pharaoh finds himself in exactly that situation. The male line of Ham had become rebellious, while the female line was not patriarchal. The Abraham text goes on to explain that the founder of the line was the woman Egyptus. It is generally agreed now that the name of Egypt was derived from Hatupeth, something like that, the house of the spirit of Ta, basically, was the original where they got the name of Egypt from. The father of the race, and hence the creator of man. Ta is one of the main gods. As we have seen, the name by which the mother goddess is known in Egypt is Hathor, written like that of Egyptus, with a house containing that other spiritual being, son and heir to all the world, Horus. Hathor, or Hatur, The house of Horus was the cow lady, crowned with horns embracing the sun's disk. Both Egyptus and Hathor are graphically designated by the same symbols. A house containing a god. It is a case of parallel names fitting parallel situations. That's from Hugh Nibley's book, One Eternal Round. There's some more information that we get here as well about the name of Egypt to add to this understanding. The entering of the lady from the north is certainly a possibility that must be considered. If ever there was a flood, figure it was Ptah of Memphis, that one whose name most scholars think today gave the name to Egypt through Canaanite editing. His good Semitic name makes him Ptah, the opener of what? Of Tat-Tenen, the newly emergent land. Before the learned began to favor the Ptah name for Egypt, the universal consensus was that the name was derived from the Egyptian word Kemi, meaning the black land. Kem means black and is easily interchanged with Kum, Khm, meaning hot and dry, that being also the name of Kem, Min, as Eugene Lefebvre argues. Certainly the ancients called Egypt, as in the Genesis Apocryphon, the land of the children of Ham. In the oldest manuscript copy of the Book of Abraham, the name Egyptus appears in Abraham 1:23 as Zeptah. Isidore says that the Pharaoh of Joseph was called Zaphanath, Zaphanath, which the Egyptians interpreted as Salvator Mundi, since he saved the land from famine. But its original meaning, says Isidore, was abscondatorum, repertorum, he who searches what is hidden or forbidden. This comes near enough to Abraham 1:23, rendering Zeptah as that which is forbidden. During the throne controversies of the 19th dynasty, a successful aspirant through the lineage of his wife, the great daughter of the king and wife of the god Tahwert, took the name of Siptah. It was in 1912 that George Darcy discovered a hitherto unknown king by the name of Siptah, and pointed to a relief at Sehel showing Seti I standing, worshipping the names of Siptah, who was a pharaoh at the time. Maspero identified Ramses Siptah with Meremptah Siptah, whom others identified with Seti I himself. The point is that the Ramessesides, who were half Canaanite, adopted the name of Siptah to placate the Egyptians by resting their alien dynasty on the oldest and most respected title to the land, the name of Siptah. A more serious candidate is presented in the name of Coptos or Coptos with a K or a C. Now hold on, just one pause here. So what he's saying is this idea of Siptah, S-I and then P-T-A-H, Siptah, is where they believe the name of Egypt came from, and the word Egypt is more of a Canaanitish interpretation of the original understanding of where the word Egypt comes from. So what happens is around the 19th dynasty is if I remember right, that is the second intermediary period of Egypt. Now the intermediary period of Egypt is a time when basically there wasn't much of a ruler in Egypt. So there's two periods, if I remember right, there's the two periods of time that divide the different major kingdom chains out, basically, that show that for a period of time there was no one really as a king of Egypt. It was kind of loosely governed area, but then eventually somebody decided we need to establish the bloodline again and move forward. And so Seti was one of those. Seti I was one of those ones that did this. Now you remember Seti was also a father of Ramesses, and this is getting the time of Moses and things too, or Ramesses. Right after that second intermediary period, Seti was a great warrior, a great general in Egypt, and so he kind of took it over. And so what he's saying is he's changing his name and adjusting what he is doing to resemble some of the more original people of Egypt, basically Siptah. So that's how they're establishing themselves as, I am a descendant, I am the rightful king because I can show this lineage here, and I'm connected to the ancient, not just the previous dynasties, but the ancient dynasties is being restored. So that's kind of what he's talking about here. But then he says that this word Koptos is another one. So Koptos was the oldest settlement of Egypt, marking the spot where the main route from the east comes upon the Nile Valley, right where the great bend in the river makes a broad plain, the ideal place for a settlement. We do not know where Nakada II's people, these are the bringers of classic Egyptian civilization, came from, wrote L.C. Baumgartel, but we find their earliest remains in that part of Egypt where the Wadi Hamat joins the Nile Valley. Koptos is situated at this junction and at no great distance across the river are Nubet, the capital, and Diosopolis, Parva. It is via Koptos that the Asiatic conquerors entered the Nile Valley in prehistoric times and founded historic Egypt. Raymond Weil asserts, from the earliest times, Koptos was a very important entrepot. It could not be otherwise with its location. All the roads converged on Koptos, including the great trade and mining roads. Egyptian civilization really began with the arrival of the second civilization, according to Morad, coming from Elam by the way of the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the route that goes from Kosir to Koptos, or Wadi Hamamat. Pliny finds it significant that Philae, the island sacred to Isis, the second Eden, was juxta oppidum Copton, right next to Koptos town. Now, some have maintained that this place, Koptos, with the oldest temple and the oldest settlement in Egypt, gave its name to the country. There existed in Egypt from prehistoric times a nome which bore the still obscure name of Kepti, or Koptos. The name was derived from the pre-Misraim inhabitants who called their capital Kepti, and the land and even their river probably by the same name. Where the early inhabitants got the name, W.J. Pythian Adams does not say, but since it could be applied to river, land, nome, town, and temple, there is no reason why a person couldn't bear it, and good reason for supposing that a person did. It is interesting that there are many Koptos legends having to do with the beginnings of the Egyptian kingdom, whereas the name Memphis, which is Hakteptah, which most scholars favor as the original, is never mentioned anywhere in that connection, and is only applied to Egypt as a whole, as we have seen by the Canaanites. The Egyptians always remembered what happened at Koptos. At Koptos, says Alien, writing at the very end, they worship Isis, and the same Koptites, note the name, reverenced female oryxes while sacrificing male oryxes, in the belief that the female oryxes are Isis's pets. Which reminds us how the desert dwellers brought baby oryxes to the lady as she sat in view of the plain of Koptos, and of the oryxes that regularly accompany the dancing goddess on the ceremonial bark. Durchain has shown us that the very oldest sacrifice in Egypt was the slaying of a male gazelle by the goddess in honor of her son Pharaoh, usually at Philae and always near there. The key to the whole history is the venerable figure of the god Min of Koptos, to which we shall return. One thinks also of Egypt as the land forbidden to the saints in early Christian and Jewish literature, cursed for its flesh pots and its stews. But this passage definitely has a philological thrust. It tells us that the Canaanite or common Old Semitic root, GPT, the vowels change constantly, but the root meaning of the consonant combination always remains the same, designates something forbidden. Well, if you take that combination of a guttural, a labial, and a dental in that order in any Semitic language, what do you get? In Arabic, the commonest meaning is to conceal, cover over, tuck, crouch, usually within the basic idea of concealing with the hand. Thus, kafata, conceal, forbid, kabata, conceal out of shame, kabada, cover, shrink from, kabut, our word capuchin, all-enveloping cloak, modesty, shame, kabeth, impure, taboo, kafata, to maintain a holy silence, keep a secret, kafada, lower the voice, abash, humble, hafitha, to keep secret, and so on for over 100 examples. Or Hebrew and Aramaic, kaba, cover or hide, kafta, shrinking, horror, kafat, draw together, close, kahaba, wrap or hide, etc. In Babylonian and Assyrian, kupt means hidden and forbidden. In the Book of the Dead, the kebt chamber is the forbidden place where all is hidden. For that matter, the suggested name, Hakteth-Ta, the secret name of Memphis, can mean the hiding place of Ta. The island of the Abaton is, as its name shows, forbidden to all mortals, and the lady of Beg, that very hidden, very secret one, was in her caves of the Nile, in her hiding place, which were at once the secret source of the Nile and the dark mountain of the Duat. Before all, however, came Kahabet, the hidden marsh, where Isis, according to some accounts, bore and according to all accounts, nursed the infant Horus, the most secret place in the world and the only place where Seth could not find him. The nest hidden in the bulrushes was the most forbidden place on earth. So we have no shortage of candidates for the original form of Egypt, which signifies that which is forbidden. So there's so much there to understand that what Joseph Smith gives us is just the straightforward part of it. But as we look back in ancient times, we see all kinds of examples through the linguistics lines that what Joseph Smith has given us in Abraham is accurate, very accurate, actually. So even predates the idea of Egypt, its name, basically going back to its origin. So a lot of fascinating stuff that's in there, so fascinating. Egypt is absolutely one of the most fascinating countries to study its history of, and I totally recommend studying Egyptian history. There's so much there, so much there. Now let's go talk a little bit more about this curse, because we talked about in verse 24 that the race preserved the curse in the land. The Ham's race basically preserved that, and they're down in Egypt. So verse 24, here's a little bit more that Hugh Nibley gives us. He says in here, it means exactly as in the Book of Mormon, that those who dwell in the land will be cursed if they do not follow God's counsels, and blessed if they do. So that's important. The curse isn't on like a race of people, like, oh, if you associate with that race, they are cursed, like they have a sickness or something. What it means is there is a condition put upon the land. If you follow God, then the land will prosper and help you. If you do not follow God, then the land will work against you. It'll be cursed, basically. That is an important point that we need to make sure we understand. It isn't necessarily a race that is cursed, but how their relationship with the God will affect how the land treats them. So if they do bad, the land makes it harder for them to do things. Okay, all those natural resources, growing food, getting water, animals, all those things is going to make it harder and harder for them to do things. But if they follow God, then all those things will now be more supportive and helpful of them. So this can be something we could look at today, is as the more wicked we get, the crazier the world and the natural elements do become because of that curse. So that's, in a way, that's really the effect of what we call global warming. So here's what he says more. As Noah was apportioning out the lands, according to the book of Jubilees, he pronounced a curse on any of his descendants who should defile the land given him by God through iniquity. Most explicitly, he warned Canaan, a bullseye for Abraham. This is the standard curse on any promised land. There is one element of the old world curse, however, that we should mention. In the traditions of Ham, Canaan, and Cain, which are connected in various ways, there is constant reference to sexual promiscuity, which definitely has something to do with the curse. Thus we are told that Nimrod slew his father Canaan and married his mother Saklas, thus launching his rule on a matriarchal footing and introducing that fatal triangle, which is the abomination of the ancients. The seed of Noah, says a recently found source, followed after the sons of Saklas, going against the will of Noah in their pride, and so perverted the whole population. Another recent discovery tells us that Satan himself rested his claim on a matriarchal line as to his followers, Canaan and Cain, who is also Ra, the son. This surprising equating of the Hebrew Cain to the Egyptian Ra in a writing attributed to John points to some very old traditions. Whether or not the story of Ra and the son's eye is of Canaanite origin, as Cyrus Gordon maintains, The Egyptian story of Astarte establishes definite connections and seems to go back to even distant Hurrian and Hittite flood legends. In Abraham 1:21 through 27, we certainly see something of that confusion that results from the mingling of patriarchal and matriarchal claims that left the pharaohs forever in doubt as to just where they stood on authority. So a lot of interesting things there to help us understand more about that. Curse was more about how people deal with their relationship with God and the land responding to them, basically. And now let's jump to verse 25. There's a little bit more here. It says, now the first government of Egypt was established by Pharaoh, the eldest son of Egyptus, the daughter of Ham. And it was after the manner of the government of Ham, which was patriarchal. So remember, there's these ideas. He's trying to establish himself as a ruler in this new land. So he kind of went off from all the other people and went off to be his own king of his own kingdom over there, basically. So Hunebly, in his book Abraham in Egypt, talks about this. He says, the sort of thing that used to happen may be surmised from an account in the Sefer Yasher, according to which at the time Abraham went into Canaan, there was a man in Sinir called Rachion, also Rakayan, suggesting in the famous Hyksos ruler Kion. He went to King Ahasuerus, or Osiris, in Egypt, the son of Enam. At the time, the king of Egypt showed himself only once a year. In Egypt, this Rachion, by trickery, raised a private army and so was able to impose a tax on all bodies brought for burial to the cemetery. This made him so rich that he went with a company of 1,000 richly dressed youths and maidens to pay his respect to Ahasuerus, who was so impressed that he changed the man's name to Pharaoh, after which Rachion judged the people of Egypt every day, while Ahasuerus was only judged one day in the year. This would not be the first or the last time that a usurping Asiatic forced a place for himself on the throne. But the ritual aspects of the tell, the annual appearance of Osiris, the rule over the necropolis, the 1,000 youths and maidens, as in the story of Solomon and Queen Bilqis, are also conspicuous. We are also told that that wily Asiatic who came to the throne by violence and trickery was the very same Pharaoh who would take Sarah to wife. So now we're getting a bit of a backstory on this Pharaoh that Abraham is dealing with, basically. Now here's a question. Why could they not have it? Why could not Ham and his line have the actual priesthood? The answer, because as noted, it came through a matriarchal suggestion. The first Pharaoh being the eldest son of Egyptus, the daughter of Ham, and it was after the manner of the government of Ham, which was patriarchal. Now Pharaoh was of a more righteous line than the sons of Ham, but daughters do not transmit patriarchal succession. In all of this, please note there is no word of race or color, though that has been the main point of attack on the book of Abraham by the enemies of the prophet. So a lot of people have talked about in trying to destroy Joseph Smith's claim to being a true prophet, they try to look at this and go, oh, you're condemning the race. This is so bad that you're putting this kind of stuff out, and realize that there's not race mentioned in here. This is more about how, again, the relationship with God that they have. And realize, as it says here, okay, even though it says that Ham supposedly had the priesthood, and if you remember, we talked about how Ham faked it. He didn't necessarily have the right to the priesthood, and but it's his daughter who his daughter's son who tries to claim that he is the ruler. But that's, again, matriarchal. It's going through the daughter to Ham. And the daughters didn't hold the priesthood, so it couldn't have had it, basically. That's just not how it worked out. It usually went father to son, not mother to son. So that's one of the challenges that they have of trying to establish that priesthood line of authority, basically. All right, now let's get into Pharaoh and learn a little bit more about him here. He says, Pharaoh, being a righteous man, established his kingdom and judged his people wisely and justly all his days, seeking earnestly to imitate that order established by the fathers in the first generations, in the days of the first patriarchal reign, even the reign of Adam, and also of Noah his father, who blessed him with the blessings of the earth and with the blessings of wisdom, but cursed him as pertaining to the priesthood. So this is a king, this is a person who wants to rule, and he wants to restore the way it used to be. The problem is he can't necessarily fully restore that. That's part of the challenge here, but he wants to get back to the old ways of living, the more original ways of doing things, basically. So anyway, he's got some good intentions and ideas here. Now, something that's really interesting that Hugh Nibley says about this, he says, according to certain ancient scriptures, which the Latter-day Saints claim have been restored by revelation in our age, Pharaoh, who represents the Afro-Asian line of Cush Nimrod, was blessed as to the kingship, but cursed as to the priesthood. And he offered Abraham the privilege of wearing his own royal insignia in hope that Abraham would return the compliment by allowing Pharaoh to wear his priestly ones, the garments of the holy priesthood, basically. According to a very old tradition, Pharaoh coveted the priesthood of Moses exactly as his ancestor Nimrod did, that of Abraham. And it was said that the pharaohs of Egypt dressed in a skin garment to show that their origin was older than time itself. So this could be an interesting tie-in, understanding that when pharaohs wear a skin of a garment made of animal skin, that could be them trying to not exemplify, but like demonstrate that their priesthood and their right to rule goes back to the coats of skin of Adam and Eve, which Noah had, we talk about, and then Ham made a copy of, and that kind of got handed down and did not continue with Ham, but went with his other sons, which Abraham later got. So now we have this challenge where Abraham has the right to priesthood, but Pharaoh has right to kingship, and he wants the right to priesthood, but he can't have that right to priesthood, basically. So really interesting ideas that are happening here as this comes together, understanding that, and I think a good, really underlying concept for us to understand is being powerful and mighty and ruling isn't what priesthood is about. Priesthood is about serving and helping others, and it's different than kings and rulers and presidents and stuff like that. So it's kings and rulers and presidents is kind of like a false priesthood of ruling over people, whereas a priesthood is about serving others and helping others, and it is tightly controlled by God himself. He knows who he's given his authority to, and he makes that clear, and we should follow those who have the right to the priesthood, the apostles, the prophet, not the worldly rulers and other people, basically. If a worldly ruler and the prophet have different opposing opinions, we should probably follow the prophet, basically. Now let's look in verse 27. Now Pharaoh, being of that lineage by which he could not have the right of priesthood, notwithstanding the pharaohs would fain claim it from Noah through Ham, therefore my father was led away by their idolatry. So again, they try to claim it, but it wasn't truly there, basically. They just try to make it sound like they had a right to it. But in actuality, it wasn't correct. So verse 28, but I shall endeavor hereafter to delineate the chronology running back from myself to the beginning of creation, for the records have come into my hands, which I hold unto this present time. So Abraham has the records of that Noah had kept, brought with the flood, of Enoch and Seth and Adam and everybody else, basically. And he's got these records. Verse 29, now after the priest of Elkanah was smitten, that he died, there came a fulfillment of those things which were said unto me concerning the land of Chaldea, that there should be a famine in the land. Accordingly, a famine prevailed throughout all the land of Chaldea, and my father was sorely tormented because of the famine, and he repented of the evil which he had determined against me to take away my life. So remember, we learn that Abraham's dad didn't like him because Abraham was very bad for the family business and tried to kill him and failed at it, basically. So finally, with this famine and all the struggles and the idols weren't working, he realized that I need to talk to Abraham. I need to get back into the real God and deal with those kinds of things. So something that's really interesting that Hugh Nibley brings up in here, and this can be found in A New Approach to Abraham, his book. He talks about the King of Bursirus. He says, from prehistoric times down to the Middle Ages, Bursirus was the traditional center of human sacrificial rites in Egypt. And it is from that the mystical King Bursirus gets his name. For it was his custom to sacrifice strangers on his cruel altars, especially Greeks. This practice began during a terrible drought when the people were starving, and the king was, of course, held responsible. So this is just an important point, understanding that the king, who is seen as the God himself or a son of God or the creator, that they try to make themselves sound like phenomenally amazing, superhuman people. And so, of course, what do the people do? They look to him to understand it. So if there's a famine, what are you doing to us? Why is the king doing this? So now the king's got to find a way to placate this. And usually sacrifices was a common way to do that. He says, a wise man and priest coming from Cyprus told the king that if he would sacrifice a man every year, the land would prosper. That got the king off the hook, and his first victim was appropriately enough the very priest, blonde noble and a stranger who suggested the operation to him. Well, Hercules heard about this and he didn't like it at all. So he went to Egypt, and being both foreign, blonde, and of royal, even divine lineage, he easily became a candidate for the sacrifice, allowing himself to be bound and put on the altar. But being a demigod with super strength, he burst his bonds at the last moment and turned the tables. This is what we see in this clever parody on the Bursirus Hydria. Hercules is making havoc among the panic-stricken priests, while the terrified high priest, kneeling on the altar, is praying for his life. And lying bound and helpless on the step at the foot of the altar is none other than Pharaoh himself, identified readily by his uraeus headdress and his beard. Here then, in an early Greek vase, quite unknown to the world of Joseph Smith, is another telling of the story of the noble captive miraculously escaping death on the altar of Pharaoh at the last moment, turning the tables and killing the priest. Most Greek versions of the story say that Hercules killed Pharaoh Bursirus too, but some deny it. It is the priest in the end who pays the price. Bursirus got himself out of a jam by sacrificing the very priest who recommended such a welcome substitute. There are cases in which the king deliberately avenged the insult to himself, resulting from the escape of an intended victim, by having the priests put to death as sacrifices instead. As soon as the Lord smote the priest that he died, the tension between Abraham and Pharaoh was released. As we have often pointed out, Abraham was taking Pharaoh's place on the altar as his enemy, his rival, his Tanist. But suddenly another substitute for the king, his own high priest, the priest of Pharaoh, and as such nothing but a substitute for the royal person, had died at the altar instead. Abraham's services were no longer needed. The king's honor had been satisfied, and no obstacle remained to his paying Abraham the respect that he now realized, and had long suspected, was due him. There is thus no contradiction in having facsimile 1 followed by facsimile 3. The whole Abraham story, strange as it is quite in keeping with ancient practice and tradition. So something just important to understand that Humility points out in here is understanding too that there was this tradition again of sacrificing people, and as it came out, there's a very common story that's been told even in Greek mythology with Hercules of the king needing to sacrifice someone, so they get a stranger and they sacrifice the stranger to the gods, so that basically saves the king, because he's the one that's supposed to be taking care of the people. He's the one that's supposed to be enriching the land and helping the people out. But when he can't, he has to find a substitute for him to do that, thus getting him off the hook with the people because somebody else dies. Well, in these legends, there is the story of, instead of that person dying, that stranger, the tables are turned and the stranger doesn't die, but the priest dies. So this concept, an idea, is something that is found in ancient writings. So the idea that Abraham was to be sacrificed in place of Pharaoh, and then the angel of the Lord came down and freed Abraham and killed the priest of Elkanah instead, and thus relieving all the issues between Pharaoh and Abraham, because Pharaoh now had his sacrifice, but Abraham was also let go. That same idea has been proven out. And again, none of that was known at the time of Joseph Smith, but Joseph Smith gave us the information that is now backed up and verified that it is actually a true tradition, true things that happen. Because if you remember, facsimile 1 is the image of Abraham being sacrificed on the lion couch, or the sacrificial bed, basically. But then we have in facsimile number 3, the symbol of Abraham sitting on the Pharaoh's throne. So this was a common idea of these year rites. Every year, the king had to prove himself to the people, and the king would make sure the people knew that he was the ruler and he was the ultimate king. And so there's lots of traditions around the year rites, things that happen. And sacrificing a visitor in place of Pharaoh was a common one. Sometimes they'd sacrifice the king, so the king's son would raise up to be the new king. But then kings realized they didn't want to have to die. They wanted to keep ruling. So they'd bring a substitute in, dress him up as king, and then kill him. And then the real king would come back up, dressed again in his clothes, saying he was resurrected. He came back. He is the real ruler. It's this whole show that they would put on every year, basically at the beginning of the new year at the time, kind of a solstice type thing sometimes. So this is an ancient tradition that Joseph Smith explained to us long before it ever was discovered in ancient antiquity, basically. So really fascinating that this is true, that has happened. And so it's so cool. It's just so cool. I love the book of Abraham. Well, let's jump on verse 31. But the records of the fathers, even the patriarchs, concerning the right of priesthood, the Lord my God preserved in mine own hands. Therefore, a knowledge of the beginning of the creation, and also of the planets and of the stars, as they were made known unto the fathers, have I kept even unto this day. And I shall endeavor to write some of these things upon this record, for the benefit of my posterity shall come after me. So he has the ancient records. These are the writings that Adam had that were passed down with Seth, and then Enoch had, and Enoch contributed to it, his writings, and those got passed down to Noah, who were handed down. So he's got the scriptures of the time, basically, these ancient writings, basically. And the fathers knew these things. They knew this. This is when you talk about the planets as stars, about creation. What comes to mind? The endowment ceremony. What is the point of understanding those things, the endowment ceremony? To understand the plan of salvation, to help us to realize what's going on. They say, I think it was President Oak said many years ago in a general conference, he says, in order to understand the gospel, we need to make sure that we understand the key point of the gospel, which is the atonement of Jesus Christ. And in order for us to understand the atonement of Jesus Christ, we need to understand what brought about that the need for the atonement, which is the fall. Now, in order to understand the fall, we need to understand what preceded the fall, which is the creation. So this gets these ideas together, so we're helping people have a good foundation to understand the plan of salvation. Basically, that's what's going on. This is why we do the temple work and things as well. So I hope you've really enjoyed Abraham chapter 1. Stay tuned for Abraham chapter 2, as we got a lot more fun stuff to talk about.